Most nations celebrate independence with fireworks, flags, and soaring speeches about destiny and freedom. Singapore didn't. On August 9, 1965, Singapore became the only country in modern history to be expelled from another nation against its will. There was no war of liberation, no victory march. If you watch the footage from that day, you don't see triumph. You see Lee Kuan Yew, Cambridge-educated, breaking down on live television. Those weren't tears of pride. They were tears of colliding with reality. Singapore was a 224-square-mile island with no oil, no farmland, no natural resources, no strategic depth, and not even enough fresh water to sustain itself. It was a Chinese-majority outpost surrounded by a hostile Malay-Muslim archipelago. Its economy was a colonial leftover tied to a mainland that had just cut it loose. To the outside world, Singapore wasn't a future success story. It was a geopolitical rounding error, a failed experiment waiting to collapse. Fast forward 60 years. That same island is now a metropolis. It is one of the richest, safest, and most efficient places on Earth. People leave $2,000 laptops unattended to reserve seats at food courts. Global elites move their billions here not for freedom, but for certainty. This transformation is often called a miracle. That word is wrong. Miracles are accidents. Singapore was designed. What happened here was a cold, relentless, high-speed national engineering project, led by a man who did not care about being loved, only about being correct. To understand why Singapore looks the way it does today, you have to understand how close it came to tearing itself apart. In the 1950s, Singapore was a decaying British outpost, often called the slum of the East. Unemployment hovered above 13%. The population was exploding faster than housing could be built. Hundreds of thousands were crammed into shop houses or illegal squatter settlements made of wood and tin. These weren't communities. They were fuel. In 1961, the Bukit Ho Swee fire erased 16,000 homes in a single afternoon. But even that wasn't the real danger. The real danger was violence. In 1964, racial riots between Chinese and Malay communities turned the streets into killing grounds. 36 people died. Hundreds were injured. People were dragged from cars and beaten to death for belonging to the wrong group. Lee Kuan Yew reached a conclusion most leaders refused to articulate. In a tiny, diverse, resource-poor country, racial favoritism isn't immoral. It's fatal. Originally, Lee believed Singapore's survival required merging with Malaysia. That assumption collapsed quickly when Malaysian politicians became too communal. Lee rejected their idea and denounced it. The outcome was inevitable. Singapore was expelled. Now consider the position Lee found himself in. A Chinese-majority island, broke, defenseless, surrounded by neighbors who did not want it to succeed. That humiliation burned itself into Singapore's DNA. Every harsh policy that followed was built around a single obsession: never be weak again. Goh's folly and the war on poverty. Lee and his chief economic strategist, Dr. Goh Keng Swee, rejected the fashionable ideology of the post-colonial world. While other newly independent states nationalized industries and expelled Western companies, Singapore did the opposite. They invited them in. Singapore had no commodities to sell, so it sold something rarer: reliability. They drained a disease-ridden, crocodile-infested swamp called Jurong and announced it would become an industrial zone. Local elites mocked the idea. They called it Goh's folly. The government didn't wait for confidence. They built first: roads, power, deep-water ports, all before a single factory arrived. Then came the Economic Development Board, an elite unit of Western-trained operators sent into American and European boardrooms with a brutally simple offer: no corruption, no labor chaos, English-speaking workforce. Contracts enforced without sentiment. The turning point came in 1968 when Texas Instruments agreed to build a semiconductor plant, from handshake to first chip, in only 50 days. That is efficiency the modern world had never seen before. Between 1965 and 1972, Singapore's industrial sector grew by roughly 20% annually. By 1975, the island had become one of the world's largest oil refining hubs, without producing a single drop of oil. Singapore didn't defeat poverty with ideology. It defeated it with execution speed. The architecture of control. Factories alone don't create loyalty. People who rent don't defend systems. They move away from them. Lee Kuan Yew didn't just build public housing, he engineered ownership. Through the Central Provident Fund, Singaporeans were required to set aside a large portion of their income. This wasn't optional or symbolic. The money didn't sit in an account earning interest. It was deliberately channeled into purchasing HDB apartments. Government-built homes that citizens actually own, not rent. By design. Today, home ownership in Singapore exceeds 89%. This wasn't an act of generosity, it was leverage. If you own property, you have something to lose. Your savings, your stability, and your future are physically tied to the country. And people with something to lose don't riot, don't gamble on chaos, and don't burn the system that protects them. But ownership alone wasn't enough. In 1964, Singapore learned what ethnic clustering leads to. Riots, burned streets, bodies. So the government removed the variable. The ethnic integration policy dictated the racial makeup of every housing block. Chinese, Malay, Indian, fixed ratios. If a quota was full, you could not sell to someone of that race. No appeals, no exceptions. You didn't choose your neighbors. The state did. You shared elevators, stairwells, schools, playgrounds, markets, every day, for decades. This wasn't multiculturalism by consent. It was enforced proximity designed to prevent civil war. Singapore didn't trust harmony to good intentions. It engineered it. Ownership wasn't freedom, it was control, and control worked. The iron fist. Mercy to the guilty is cruelty to the innocent. Lee's governance strongly reflected this principle. And that's why 98% of Singaporeans feel safe in the streets at night. For the system to function, the law could not be flexible. It had to be predictable. While the Western countries were concerned about human rights violations of criminals, Singapore implemented capital punishment for serious drug trafficking and harsh punishments like caning for vandalism, immigration violations, and violent crime. Not because it was cruel, but because uncertainty was unacceptable. In 1994, that philosophy collided with the West. An American teenager named Michael Fay was arrested for vandalizing cars. In many Western cities, this would barely register as a crime. In Singapore, it was treated as an attack on order itself. He was sentenced to caning. The backlash was immediate. American media erupted. President Bill Clinton personally requested clemency. U.S. senators protested. Singapore adjusted the sentence slightly to 4 canes instead of 6, then carried it out. The message wasn't emotional, it was procedural. The law in Singapore does not negotiate. It does not care who you are or where you're from. Singapore didn't punish to satisfy anger. It punished to eliminate uncertainty. The aesthetics of power. Even Singapore's beauty was functional. Lee believed cleanliness and greenery were economic signals. A filthy city suggested a careless government. A controlled environment suggested competence. Trees were planted deliberately. Species were selected for shade efficiency. Maintenance was obsessive. Even buildings were made in a way which naturally cooled the air in extreme hot summers. Air conditioning was treated as infrastructure. Lee openly called it one of the most important inventions in history. Climate control wasn't about politics. It was about making Singapore better. Lee changed Singapore from a mud pool to a green metropolis. From wigs to wealth, Singaporeans never became overconfident in themselves. When China and Vietnam opened cheap labor markets, Singapore didn't compete. It upgraded. Low-value manufacturing was discarded the moment it became obsolete. Electronics replaced textiles. Biotech replaced electronics. Finance replaced everything. That's why Singapore is the financial capital of the East. Even gambling was eventually tolerated, not out of moral compromise, but strategic necessity. Integrated resorts were approved with restrictions that priced locals out while welcoming foreign capital. Adaptation became policy. The existential threat. Nothing reveals Singapore's paranoia like water. For decades, Malaysia controlled its supply and threatened to cut it during disputes. Singapore responded by eliminating dependence, rainwater capture, desalination, ultra-purified, reclaimed wastewater. They marketed recycled sewage as technological triumph, and it worked. By the time the final water agreement expires, Singapore will not need permission to survive. Now Malaysians have more water problems. While they had everything one could have wished, Singapore didn't complain. They didn't ask the UN or the US for help. They fixed it themselves. Nothing is wasted. Most countries treat waste as a problem. Singapore treats it as a resource. This isn't environmental idealism, it's necessity. Singapore is small, land is scarce. Landfills are a luxury it cannot afford. By the late 1970s, the government realized something uncomfortable. If they didn't control trash, trash would control them. So they did what Singapore always does. They engineered the system. Today, nearly all of Singapore's waste is incinerated. But this isn't burning trash in a pit. These are high-efficiency waste-to-energy plants that turn garbage into electricity. Trash comes in, power comes out. About 90% of Singapore's waste volume disappears through incineration, generating enough electricity to power tens of thousands of homes. What remains, ash and slag, isn't dumped randomly. It's transported offshore and used to build Semakau landfill, an artificial island engineered with marine-grade lining to prevent pollution. Even the landfill is optimized. Semakau isn't a dump. It's clean enough to host mangroves, wildlife, and even recreational fishing. The world sees an island paradise. What it really is the physical byproduct of Singapore's consumption. Neatly contained, tightly controlled, and economically useful. This is the Singapore mindset in its purest form. Recycling follows the same logic. Singapore doesn't romanticize it. Recycling rates are tracked, enforced, and industrialized. Food waste is converted into biogas. Industrial waste is sorted, resold, or repurposed. Even sewage, once the ultimate symbol of waste, is transformed into new water, purified so thoroughly it's cleaner than bottled water. In most countries, trash is where systems fail. In Singapore, trash is where systems prove they work. When Lee Kuan Yew talked about survival, this is what he meant. Not speeches, not slogans. Systems so tight that even garbage becomes an asset. Conclusion: the Iron Hand's shadow. Lee Kuan Yew died in 2015. What he left behind should not exist. Singapore wasn't built on hope or kindness. It was built on discipline, paranoia, and a refusal to indulge weakness. Lee believed leadership wasn't about popularity. It was about outcomes. He turned a swamp into a diamond so polished the world forgot its origin. Singapore remains a living experiment. Proof that vision, enforced without sentimentality, can bend history. The future may be softer, but it was paid for by a past that wasn't.